A young African-American boy burst into St. Gabriel's Medical Center, his small frame trembling under the weight of a pale, motionless infant cradled in his arms. The cold January wind howled behind him, sending icy tendrils through the automatic doors as they hissed shut. His dark eyes, wide with terror, darted around the brightly lit lobby, searching for help. But before he could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the air like a whip. "Stop right there!" A security officer stationed by the entrance stepped forward, his hand resting on the pepper spray clipped to his belt. The boy froze, his breath visible in the frigid air still clinging to his damp hoodie. The tension in the room thickened, every eye in the waiting area fixed on the scene unfolding. "Please," the boy gasped, his voice hoarse from running. She needs help." He shifted the infant in his arms, and for a moment, the tiny girl let out a weak, rattling cry. The sound was enough to snap Dr. Nathaniel Everett into action. Emerging from the hallway with his white coat billowing behind him, the seasoned physician surveyed the situation with a single glance. His sharp blue eyes landed on the boy, then on the bundle in his arms. Years of experience had taught him to prioritize life over suspicion. "Give her to me," Dr. Everett said, his tone brooking no argument as he held out his arms. The boy hesitated for only a second before he handed the baby over. The weight of her frail body left his arms feeling cold and empty. Dr. Everett cradled the child with practiced ease, his fingers immediately feeling the unnatural chill of her skin. He turned toward the nurses who had already begun moving with swift efficiency. "Get a crash cart and a warming blanket. Call respiratory and pediatric ICU. Stat," he barked, his voice echoing down the sterile corridors. The boy stood rooted to the spot, his soaked sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All he could do was watch as the baby was whisked away on a gurney, her tiny body dwarfed by the machines being wheeled alongside her. Hours earlier, that same boy, whose name was Elijah Walker, had been racing through the cold streets of Albany, New York. His legs burned from the effort, but he pushed himself harder, clutching the infant to his chest. The icy wind cut through his tattered hoodie, numbing his arms and making every step a challenge. Wrapped in a faded baby blanket, the child stirred weakly against him, her labored breaths like a clock ticking down. Her faint wheezing was a constant reminder of how little time they had. "Just hold on," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling as much from fear as from the cold. "I'll get you help." The glowing sign of St. Gabriel's emergency room came into view, its letters flickering faintly against the cloudy night sky. To Elijah, it looked like a lighthouse in a storm, promising safety even as doubt gnawed at him. What if they don't believe me? He shoved the thought aside and focused on reaching the doors. He had no other choice. Back inside the hospital, the air was thick with unspoken questions. The security officer, a stocky man named Doug Larson, kept a wary eye on Elijah, his hand still resting on his belt. Doug was a veteran of the ER. He'd seen everything from bar brawls to domestic disputes spill through these doors, and his instincts told him that something about this kid didn't add up. "What's your name, kid?" Doug asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Elijah," the boy mumbled, his gaze fixed on the swinging doors through which the baby had disappeared. "And who's the baby to you?" Elijah hesitated. I found her. Behind my apartment building. She was crying, and she looked like she couldn't breathe right." Doug's eyes narrowed. "You're saying you just found her, out of nowhere?" "I swear," Elijah's voice cracked. "I didn't know what else to do. She needed help." Before Doug could press further, Dr. Everett reappeared, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He strode toward Elijah, his white coat now smudged with faint traces of dirt from the baby's blanket. "Where did you say you found her?" Dr. Everett asked, his voice low but insistent. "In the alley behind my building. On Broad Street," Elijah replied, his words tumbling over one another. "There's a spot where people leave stuff sometimes. Old clothes, broken furniture. I don't know. I heard her crying, and she was just there. Dr. Everett studied the boy for a long moment, his piercing gaze searching for any sign of dishonesty. He found none. Turning to Doug, he spoke with authority. We don't have time to second guess. This child needs immediate care. Get social services on the line, but for now keep this area secure. Doug nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. As Elijah sat in the waiting area, his wet clothes clinging to him uncomfortably, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him. The nurses, the patients, even the janitor pushing a mop across the floor, they all seemed to be whispering, their eyes filled with questions he couldn't answer. He clenched his fists, his fingernails digging into his palms. What if they think I did something to her? What if they don't believe me? From behind the reception desk, Nurse Carolyn watched the boy with a mix of suspicion and sympathy. Her decades of experience had taught her that troubled kids often carried heavier burdens than they let on. Poor kid, she muttered under her breath. But her gaze lingered, her instincts warning her that this was far from over. Elijah sat on the edge of a rigid plastic chair in the waiting area, his legs bouncing nervously as cold air continued to seep from his drenched clothes. Around him, the bustle of the hospital carried on. Nurses hurried past with charts in hand. Patients whispered to their companions, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the gaps of silence. Yet, for Elijah, everything blurred. All he could see was the swinging double doors where the baby had been taken, and all he could hear was the echo of her faint cries. His throat tightened. Had he done the right thing by bringing her here? Or had he just made things worse? Dr. Everett reappeared from the hallway, his calm demeanor showing only the faintest signs of wear. He had dealt with countless emergencies in his career, but something about this case was gnawing at him. The boy's story was strange, no doubt, but there was a rawness in Elijah's voice, a desperation that felt real. The doctor approached the reception desk, speaking to one of the senior nurses in hushed tones. "Any word from CPS yet?" he asked, referring to Child Protective Services. "Not yet," the nurse replied, flipping through a stack of forms. "They're stretched thin tonight, but they said they'd send someone as soon as possible. Could be hours, though." Dr. Everett frowned. Hours might be too long. His mind flicked back to the infant. Lily Rose, the boy had called her. Her oxygen levels were improving, but she wasn't out of danger yet. If her condition took a turn for the worse, they'd need answers fast. Elijah caught snippets of their conversation and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew how it looked. A teenage boy, soaked to the bone, showing up with a baby and no explanation other than, "I found her." It wasn't a story anyone would believe, not without proof. But what proof could he offer? He'd acted on instinct, not logic, when he'd picked her up from the cold concrete and run to the hospital. He glanced at his reflection in the polished floor. His hoodie, too big for his thin frame, hung heavy with rain. His jeans were streaked with dirt from the alley and his sneakers, already on their last legs, squished with every shift of his weight. He looked like trouble, and he knew it. The sound of purposeful footsteps pulled Elijah's attention. 2 security officers had entered the waiting area, their presence casting a heavy shadow over the room. They exchanged a quick word with Dr. Everett before turning their attention to Elijah. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, approached with measured steps. "Son," the officer began, his tone neutral but firm, "we're going to need to ask you a few questions." Elijah's heart sank. He nodded wordlessly, his voice caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. The officer gestured for Elijah to follow him to a quieter corner of the room, away from the prying eyes of other patients. As they moved, Elijah felt the weight of their gazes, a mix of curiosity and suspicion that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "Let's start with your name," the officer said, pulling out a small notepad. "Elijah Walker," he replied, his voice barely audible. "And the baby? You said you found her behind your building?" Elijah nodded. "I heard her crying when I was taking out the trash. She was just there, wrapped in that blanket." He gestured to the threadbare cloth that now lay on the floor near the reception desk. "Do you have any idea who left her there?" the officer pressed. "No," Elijah said, shaking his head. "I didn't see anyone. It was dark and I knew I couldn't leave her there." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who stood nearby, arms crossed. There was skepticism in their expressions, but also a hint of something else. Pity, perhaps, or recognition of the fear in Elijah's eyes. "All right, Elijah," the first officer said, closing his notepad. "We're going to need you to stay here while we look into this. Don't go anywhere." "I won't," Elijah promised, though he wasn't sure they believed him. As the officers walked away, Elijah sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was on trial for a crime he hadn't committed. But what stung the most was the doubt, both theirs and his own. Had he done enough to save her? And if she didn't make it, would they blame him? From across the room, Nurse Carolyn watched Elijah with quiet intensity. Her instincts told her that there was more to this boy's story than he was letting on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his fear was genuine. She approached him cautiously, her years of experience guiding her steps. "Hey there," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. "How are you holding up?" Elijah glanced at her, startled by her kindness. "I don't know," he admitted. I need to know if she's okay." Carolyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Dr. Everett is one of the best we've got. If anyone can help her, it's him. And you? You did the right thing bringing her here. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Elijah blinked back the tears, threatening to spill over. Her words were a small comfort, but they couldn't quiet the storm of worry raging inside him. In the treatment room, Dr. Everett worked with quiet determination. Lily Rose's condition had stabilized, but her small frame still looked fragile under the web of wires and monitors surrounding her. The oxygen mask covered most of her tiny face, but her color was improving, a good sign. The doctor leaned over her, his stethoscope pressed to her chest. The rhythmic sound of her heartbeat reassured him, but questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she been abandoned in the cold? Dr. Everett's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Carolyn, who handed him a fresh set of vitals. "The boy's story," she began, her voice low. "Do you believe him?" Dr. Everett paused, his brow furrowing. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if he's lying, he's a damn good actor." Carolyn nodded, her gaze drifting back toward the waiting area where Elijah sat alone. "I think there's more to him than meets the eye," Dr. Everett sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Maybe, but until we know for sure, we can't take any chances." Elijah remained in his seat, his eyes fixed on the double doors that had swallowed up the baby. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching into eternity. Around him, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The rustle of papers at the reception desk, the quiet murmur of a nurse giving instructions, the low hum of the vending machine in the corner. It was as if time itself had conspired to make him suffer, trapping him in this limbo of waiting and uncertainty. He clutched the frayed edges of his hoodie, pulling them tight as if they could shield him from the accusing stares that lingered whenever someone passed by. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again. The sound of the baby crying, the way she had felt so small and cold in his arms, the faint, wheezing breaths that had driven him to run faster than he ever thought possible. "Hey, kid." The voice startled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Nurse Rosalind, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. Her curly hair was streaked with gray, and her ID badge hung from a lanyard decorated with tiny sunflowers. She carried a cup of steaming hot cocoa, which she held out to him. "Thought you might need something warm," she said, sitting down beside him. Elijah hesitated before taking the cup, his fingers wrapping around the paper surface. The heat seeped into his hands, a welcome relief from the chill that had settled into his bones. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rosalind studied him for a moment, her gentle gaze searching his face. "You look like you've had a rough night." Elijah gave a small nod. Yeah, you could say that. Want to talk about it? He shook his head, staring into the swirling foam at the top of the cocoa. Not much to say. I found her and I didn't know what else to do. I just couldn't leave her there. Rosalind nodded, her expression thoughtful. That takes a lot of courage, you know. Not everyone would have done what you did. Elijah glanced at her, unsure whether to believe her words. The doubt he'd seen in the faces of the security officers, the doctor, and even some of the nurses had left a mark. Had he done enough to save her? And if she didn't make it, would they blame him? From across the room, Nurse Carolyn watched Elijah with quiet intensity. Her instincts told her that there was more to this boy's story than he was letting on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his fear was genuine. She approached him cautiously, her years of experience guiding her steps. "Hey there," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. "How are you holding up?" Elijah glanced at her, startled by her kindness. "I don't know," he admitted. I need to know if she's okay." Carolyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Doctor, Everett is one of the best we've got. If anyone can help her, it's him. And you? You did the right thing bringing her here. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Elijah blinked back the tears threatening to spill over. Her words were a small comfort, but they couldn't quiet the storm of worry raging inside him. In the treatment room, Dr. Everett worked with quiet determination. Lily Rose's condition had stabilized, but her small frame still looked fragile under the web of wires and monitors surrounding her. The oxygen mask covered most of her tiny face, but her color was improving. A good sign. The doctor leaned over her, his stethoscope pressed to her chest. The rhythmic sound of her heartbeat reassured him, but questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she been abandoned in the cold? Dr. Everett's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Carolyn, who handed him a fresh set of vitals. "The boy's story," she began, her voice low. "Do you believe him?" Dr. Everett paused, his brow furrowing. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if he's lying, he's a damn good actor." Carolyn nodded, her gaze drifting back toward the waiting area where Elijah sat alone. "I think there's more to him than meets the eye." Dr. Everett sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Maybe. But until we know for sure, we can't take any chances." Elijah remained in his seat, his eyes fixed on the double doors that had swallowed up the baby. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching into eternity. Around him, the world seemed to move in slow motion, the rustle of papers at the reception desk, the quiet murmur of a nurse giving instructions, the low hum of the vending machine in the corner. It was as if time itself had conspired to make him suffer, trapping him in this limbo of waiting and uncertainty. He clutched the frayed edges of his hoodie, pulling them tight as if they could shield him from the accusing stares that lingered whenever someone passed by. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again. The sound of the baby crying, the way she had felt so small and cold in his arms, the faint, wheezing breaths that had driven him to run faster than he ever thought possible. "Hey, kid." The voice startled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Nurse Rosalind, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. Her curly hair was streaked with gray, and her ID badge hung from a lanyard decorated with tiny sunflowers. She carried a cup of steaming hot cocoa, which she held out to him. "Thought you might need something warm," she said, sitting down beside him. Elijah hesitated before taking the cup, his fingers wrapping around the paper surface. The heat seeped into his hands, a welcome relief from the chill that had settled into his bones. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rosalind studied him for a moment, her gentle gaze searching his face. "You look like you've had a rough night." Elijah gave a small nod. "Yeah, you could say that. Want to talk about it?" He shook his head, staring into the swirling foam at the top of the cocoa. Not much to say. I found her and I didn't know what else to do. I just couldn't leave her there. Rosalind nodded, her expression thoughtful. That takes a lot of courage, you know. Not everyone would have done what you did. Elijah glanced at her, unsure whether to believe her words. The doubt he'd seen in the faces of the security officers, the doctor, and even some of the nurses had left a mark. Most people just see a kid like me and think I'm trouble, he said quietly, his voice tinged with bitterness. Rosalind's smile softened. Well, I see someone who did the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. That says a lot about the kind of person you are. Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, offering a small measure of comfort. But before he could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps interrupted their conversation. Dr. Everett approached, his expression serious. Rosalind stood, stepping aside as the doctor addressed Elijah directly. She's stable for now, Dr. Everett said, his tone professional but not unkind. Her oxygen levels are back to normal and we're running tests to figure out what's going on. But we need to talk, Elijah. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. Elijah swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the cup of cocoa. I already told you everything, he said, his voice trembling. Dr. Everett's sharp eyes softened slightly. I know, but the authorities are involved now. They'll want to know more, about you, about where she came from, about everything. Elijah's stomach twisted into knots. Am I in trouble? That depends, Dr. Everett replied, his voice even. If you're telling the truth, then no. But if there's something you're not saying, now's the time to come clean. I swear I'm not lying, Elijah blurted, the words spilling out in a rush. I found her just like I told you. She was behind the building and it was so cold and she couldn't breathe right. I didn't know what else to do. Rosalind stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. Doctor, he's been nothing but honest since he got here, she said firmly. And he's clearly shaken up. Maybe we should give him a little space. Dr. Everett hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But we're keeping him here until CPS and the police get a clearer picture of what's going on. As Dr. Everett walked away, Rosalind crouched down to meet Elijah's gaze. You're doing everything you can, Elijah, she said gently. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Elijah nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He sipped the hot cocoa, the sweetness of fleeting distraction from the storm of worry that refused to leave him. Outside the hospital, the chaos was growing. News vans lined the curb, their logos emblazoned on the sides in bold letters. Reporters jostled for position near the police tape, their voices competing to be heard over the cacophony of camera clicks and muffled protests from frustrated passers-by. Breaking news from St. Gabriel's Medical Center, a young journalist announced, her breath visible in the chilly night air. A baby girl, believed to be no more than a few months old, was brought to the ER under mysterious circumstances. Authorities have confirmed that the hospital is currently on lockdown as they investigate the situation. Behind her, the flashing lights of police cruisers painted the scene in hues of red and blue. Officers moved to disperse the growing crowd of onlookers, their voices firm but calm. Inside, the tension was palpable. Patients and staff alike cast nervous glances toward the doors, the weight of the lockdown pressing down on them. For some, it was an inconvenience. For others, a cause for outright frustration. A man in a business suit paced near the reception desk, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he snapped at the nearest nurse. "I've been waiting for hours and now you're telling me I can't leave? I have a flight to catch in the morning." "Sir, please calm down," the nurse replied, her tone measured. "The lockdown is for everyone's safety. We're doing our best to resolve the situation as quickly as possible." Nearby, a young mother clutched her toddler tightly, her eyes darting nervously around the room. An elderly man with a cane muttered under his breath, shaking his head in frustration. The waiting area, once a place of quiet patience, had become a pressure cooker of fear and confusion. Elijah felt every ounce of that tension as he sat in his corner, his legs drawn up to his chest. He wished he could disappear, to shrink so small that no one would notice him. But the baby's face haunted him, her pale features and labored breaths etched into his memory. He had done the right thing. He had to believe that. Dr. Everett stood in his office, his hands resting on the edge of his desk as he stared at the medical chart before him. Lily Rose's vitals had stabilized, but her blood work revealed troubling signs. Elevated white blood cell counts, indicative of an infection, possibly pneumonia. She needed immediate antibiotics and continuous monitoring. He sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the situation. His thoughts drifted back to Elijah, sitting alone in the waiting area, and the lingering doubts surrounding the boy's story. Was Elijah truly the Good Samaritan he claimed to be? Or was there more to the situation than met the eye? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Nurse Rosalind entered, her expression resolute. "You need to go easier on that boy, doctor," she said, crossing her arms. "He's scared out of his mind. And from what I've seen, he's telling the truth." Dr. Everett leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not about whether I believe him. It's about the facts. We have a baby in critical condition and no answers. The authorities expect me to cooperate, and I can't just ignore the protocols." Rosalind shook her head. "Sometimes the protocols get in the way of doing what's right. That boy risked everything to bring her here. I've seen guilty people before, Nathan, and that's not what I see in him." Dr. Everett met her gaze, her words striking a chord. He wanted to believe Elijah, but years of experience had taught him to be cautious. The stakes were too high to let emotion cloud his judgment. In the waiting area, Elijah's anxiety had reached a fever pitch. The sound of the ticking clock seemed to grow louder with each passing second, the steady rhythm like a drumbeat in his ears. His thoughts raced. What would happen to Lily Rose? Would they believe him? Would they send him back to foster care or worse, jail? The double doors swung open, and 2 officers stepped into the room. Their presence was a reminder that Elijah's ordeal was far from over. "Elijah Walker," one of them called, his deep voice cutting through the din of murmured conversations. Elijah stood, his legs trembling as he approached them. "Come with us," the officer said. Elijah glanced at Nurse Rosalind, who gave him an encouraging nod. Her small gesture gave him the strength to take the first step, even as fear clawed at his chest. The officers led him to a small consultation room, its walls bare save for a clock and a framed poster about hand hygiene. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the worn table and chairs. Elijah sat down, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. One officer remained standing, while the other sat across from him, flipping open a notebook. "All right, Elijah," the seated officer began. "We need to know everything you remember about tonight. Start from the beginning." Elijah took a shaky breath. "I was taking out the trash behind my building on Broad Street. It was late and it was cold. That's when I heard her crying." He paused, his voice faltering. "At first I thought it was just a cat or something, but then I saw her. She was wrapped in that old blanket, lying near the dumpsters. She looked so small and her breathing sounded wrong." The officer leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You didn't see anyone else? No cars driving away? No one nearby?" Elijah shook his head. "Number it was just her." "And you didn't think to call 911? "My phone's dead," Elijah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the payphone in my building hasn't worked in months. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran here." The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. But before they could press further, a knock on the door interrupted them. Dr. Everett entered, his expression grim. "Officers, I need to speak with Elijah privately," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officers hesitated before nodding and stepping out. Dr. Everett closed the door behind them and turned to Elijah. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice softer now. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about tonight. If there's anything you're not telling us, it's going to come out eventually." Elijah met his gaze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not lying, Doctor. Everett, I just wanted to help her." For a moment, the room was silent. Dr. Everett studied the boy, his own doubts warring with the instinctual belief that Elijah was telling the truth. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "For now, I'll take you at your word, but I need you to stay here until we sort this out." Hours passed, and dawn began to break over the city. The once chaotic hospital had settled into an uneasy calm, though the presence of reporters outside served as a constant reminder of the scrutiny they faced. Elijah sat by the window in the waiting area, watching the first rays of sunlight creep over the horizon. His exhaustion was palpable, but he refused to sleep. He couldn't, not while Lily Rose was still fighting to recover. Rosalind approached, carrying a blanket and a tray of food. "You need to eat something," she said gently, placing the tray on the table beside him. Elijah shook his head. "I'm not hungry." Rosalind sighed and draped the blanket over his shoulders. "Just try, okay? You've been through a lot, and you won't be able to help her if you run yourself into the ground." He nodded reluctantly, picking at the toast on the tray. In the pediatric ICU, Lily Rose lay in her bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. The monitors around her beeped softly, their sounds a comforting indication that she was stable. Dr. Everett stood at the foot of her bed, his hands in his pockets as he observed her progress. The baby's condition had improved significantly overnight, though she would still need careful monitoring in the days to come. A knock at the door drew his attention. It was one of the officers from earlier. "Dr. Everett," the officer said, his tone serious. "We found something. There was a security camera near the alley where Elijah said he found her. The footage shows him running out of the building and straight to the baby. No one else is in sight." Dr. Everett exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "So he was telling the truth." The officer nodded. "Looks that way. We're still investigating, but as far as we can tell, that boy saved her life." Dr. Everett felt a surge of relief, mixed with a twinge of guilt for doubting Elijah. Back in the waiting area, Rosalind approached Elijah with a smile. "Good news," she said. "They've reviewed the footage, and it looks like you're off the hook. You did exactly what you said you did. Nothing more, nothing less." Elijah felt a rush of emotion, his chest tightening as tears welled in his eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he could breathe again. "And Lily Rose?" he asked, his voice trembling. "She's stable," Rosalind replied, "and she's going to be just fine thanks to you." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. The angry murmurs in the waiting area were now punctuated by sharper outbursts. Patients stood in tight clusters, their voices rising in collective frustration. "This is insane! You can't keep us locked in here like prisoners!" shouted a man in a business suit, his tie loosened and his face red from agitation. A young mother holding a crying toddler looked around nervously, clutching her child tighter. "I have other kids at home," she said, her voice quivering but edged with urgency. "They need me." "I work night shifts," another woman called out, her scrubs rumpled. "This isn't fair. What about our rights?" The sound of protests swirled through the space, creating a cacophony of fear and anger. Hospital staff moved quickly, trying to calm the growing tension. Security guards stationed at the doors remained vigilant, their hands hovering near radios clipped to their belts. In the middle of this storm, Elijah, his head hung low and his legs curled to his chest, sat in a consultation room, oblivious to the chaos outside. The small, sterile space felt like a cell, the plain white walls pressing down on him. A television mounted in the corner remained off, leaving the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights to fill the oppressive silence. He stared down at his sneakers, scuffed and dirtied from the night's events. His fingers fidgeted with the frayed threads of his hoodie, twisting and pulling as if the motion could keep his thoughts from spiraling. The weight of everything, Lily Rose's fragile state, The suspicions, the overwhelming guilt, pressed heavily on his chest. Through the consultation room's small, rectangular window, he caught glimpses of the hospital staff moving hurriedly through the corridors. Somewhere on the other side of the building, Lily Rose was fighting to breathe. The thought twisted his stomach, sending waves of nausea and helplessness coursing through him. He thought back to the alley where he'd found her. The dark, cold space between the dumpsters had seemed like a tomb, her faint cries the only sign of life. He could still feel the chill of the concrete beneath his feet, the icy wind cutting through his thin clothes as he'd knelt down to pick her up. Outside, the chaos continued to escalate. The growing crowd of reporters and news vans outside Memorial Hospital spilled into neighboring parking lots, their cameras trained on the building. Each journalist jockeyed for the best position, eager to capture the drama unfolding within the hospital's locked doors. "This is Linda Martinez reporting live from Memorial Hospital," one reporter said, her face the picture of calm professionalism as she addressed the camera. Authorities remained tight-lipped about the cause of the lockdown, fueling speculation about what may have occurred. Rumors of an abandoned baby found under suspicious circumstances continue to circulate, but hospital officials have refused to comment. Behind her, another reporter gestured animatedly toward the hospital, her voice rising with practiced urgency. "What is Memorial Hospital hiding? That's the question on everyone's mind tonight. The lockdown, now entering its 5th hour, has left patients, visitors, and staff trapped inside. With no answers forthcoming, frustration is mounting both inside and out." The lenses of dozens of cameras glinted in the light of the hospital's entrance, creating a surreal tableau of media scrutiny. The air outside buzzed with tension, matching the atmosphere inside the building. Elijah sat frozen in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The sterile smell of the room stung his nose, a constant reminder of where he was. The events of the night replayed endlessly in his mind. The moment he'd heard Lily Rose's cries, the weight of her tiny body in his arms, the suspicious look of the security guard when he'd stumbled into the ER. The sound of the door opening jolted him out of his thoughts. A young nurse entered, carrying a plastic tray with a sandwich and a small carton of apple juice. Her name tag glinted in the harsh fluorescent light as she placed the tray on the small table beside him. "You should try to eat something," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Elijah looked at the food but turned away slightly, his appetite non-existent. The smell of the sandwich made his stomach churn. He mumbled a quiet, "Thanks," without meeting her eyes. As the nurse left, Elijah found himself staring at the floor tiles, counting the specks of gray embedded in the white surface. The monotonous task helped him keep his anxiety at bay, but only just. His thoughts kept drifting to Ms. Hodgkins, his caseworker. If only she would check her messages and come to the hospital. She'd know how to explain everything to the staff. She always did. Unlike the other social workers he'd had in the past, Ms. Hodgkins had treated him like a person. She remembered his birthday, brought him his favorite candy, and even sat through one of his terrible piano recitals without a single complaint. The door creaked open again, and Nurse Rosalind stepped inside. She was a calming presence, her soft smile and warm brown eyes immediately putting Elijah at ease. She carried a chair over and sat down beside him, her posture relaxed but attentive. "You're doing okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Elijah shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I guess." Rosalind leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees. "You did the right thing bringing her here," she said firmly. Elijah let out a shaky breath. "What happens if they think I'm lying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosalind's pause was heavy, the kind of silence that carried weight. Finally, she reached out and placed her hand on the arm of his chair, her touch steady and grounding. "Then we'll deal with it together," she said. "You're not alone in this." Elijah lifted his head slightly, glancing through the window. From his vantage point, he could see into the room where Lily Rose lay. Nurses moved around her tiny form, checking machines and adjusting her blanket. She looked so small, so fragile, that it made his chest ache. "I just need her to be okay," he murmured, his voice cracking. His fingers gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles turning white. Through the window, the monitors near Lily Rose's bed began to beep erratically. The sound cut through the air like an alarm, pulling everyone's attention. Nurses scrambled to check her vitals, their faces growing tense. Dr. Everett entered the room quickly, his movements sharp with purpose. "Her temperature's spiking," a nurse reported. 103.2 and climbing. "Get me a chest x-ray and a complete blood count, stat," Dr. Everett ordered, his voice steady but urgent. He adjusted the IV line with practiced efficiency, his jaw tightening as he listened to Lily Rose's labored breaths. Elijah pressed his palms against the consultation room's window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the medical team work. His heart raced as he saw the concern etched on their faces. He felt utterly powerless, a bystander in a moment that meant everything. The beeping of Lily Rose's monitors grew faster, a staccato rhythm that filled the treatment room with urgency. Dr. Everett moved with practiced precision, his eyes flicking between the machines and the tiny patient before him. "She's showing signs of sepsis," he said, his voice clipped as he snapped on a pair of gloves. "We need to start her on broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately." A nurse adjusted the baby's oxygen mask while another prepped a syringe. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast stark shadows across their faces, each furrowed brow betraying the tension of the moment. Lily Rose's small body convulsed with another coughing fit, her chest heaving as she struggled for breath. The sound sent a jolt through everyone in the room, an audible reminder of how fragile her condition was. Outside the treatment room, Elijah's hands pressed harder against the glass, his breath forming small clouds of fog. He flinched at every alarm, every sudden movement from the staff. His heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of his chest. "She's fighting," Rosalind said softly, standing beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her steady grip anchoring him to the moment. "That little girl has more strength than you realize." Elijah swallowed hard, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. "What if it's not enough?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Rosalind didn't answer immediately. Her eyes followed the movements of the medical team, her expression a mix of hope and worry. "We just have to believe it is," she finally said. Dr. Everett scanned the latest test results, his frown deepening. He turned to the nurse closest to him. "What's the status on those culture reports?" "Still pending," she replied, her tone apologetic. Dr. Everett's jaw clenched. Time was slipping away, and they needed to act now. His mind raced through the possibilities. Bacterial pneumonia, viral infection, something congenital. Each option carried its own risks and required different treatments. "She needs specialized care," he muttered under his breath. He thought about Children's Memorial, the hospital across town. They had a pediatric pulmonologist on call and the resources to handle complex cases like Lily Rose's. But the lockdown meant no transfers, no exceptions. The board had made that painfully clear. His frustration boiled over as he stepped into the hallway, running a hand through his graying hair. Rosalind met him halfway, her expression resolute. "We can't keep waiting," she said, her voice firm. "If we don't get her the help she needs—" "I know," Dr. Everett interrupted, his tone sharp with stress, "but my hands are tied." "Then untie them," Rosalind shot back, her eyes blazing. "Do you want to be the doctor who let a baby die because of red tape?" Her words hit like a slap. Dr. Everett's shoulders tensed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the treatment room, where Lily Rose's frail body lay surrounded by machines. For a moment, he was transported back in time, to a similar hospital room, to the face of a young boy who had nearly slipped through his fingers because he'd been too cautious, too by the book. The memory of that night still haunted him, the sound of the boy's mother's cries echoing in his mind. "Call Dr. Patel," he said finally, his voice low but decisive. "Tell her we need a pulmonologist, and we need her now." Rosalind didn't hesitate. She strode to the nearest phone, her fingers flying over the keypad as she paged the pediatric specialist. Minutes later, Dr. Priya Patel arrived, her presence commanding the room. Dressed in crisp scrubs, she exuded confidence as she quickly assessed the situation. "She's in respiratory distress," Dr. Patel said, glancing at the monitors. "We need to clear her airways and stabilize her oxygen levels immediately. But in her condition—" She trailed off, her expression grim. "There are risks," Dr. Everett finished for her, nodding. "I know, but we're out of options." Dr. Patel's dark eyes flicked to Lily Rose, her resolve hardening. "Let's get to work." Together, the two doctors and their team moved with practiced efficiency. Rosalind assisted, her hands steady as she handed over instruments and monitored the baby's vitals. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into eternity. Elijah watched from the hallway, his face pressed against the window. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the frame, every fiber of his being willing Lily Rose to pull through. Inside, the doctors worked tirelessly. Dr. Patel's hands moved with precision as she performed the emergency procedure, her focus unwavering. Dr. Everett stood at her side, ready to assist at a moment's notice. The soft hum of the machines and the doctor's quiet commands were the only sounds in the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the monitors began to stabilize. The erratic beeping slowed, replaced by a steady rhythm that signaled progress. "She's stable," Dr. Patel announced, a faint smile breaking through her professional demeanor. Relief washed over the team like a wave, the weight of their collective anxiety lifting. Dr. Everett let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. News of Lily Rose's stabilization spread quickly through the hospital, reaching the waiting area where the crowd had grown restless. A nurse stepped forward to address the group, her voice calm but firm. "The baby is stable," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a balm. "She's not out of the woods yet, but she's improving." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. Some people clapped, others simply closed their eyes in silent gratitude. The makeshift vigil that had formed earlier began to take on a renewed sense of purpose. Elijah, still standing by the treatment room window, felt the news wash over him. His knees nearly buckled with relief, and he pressed his forehead against the glass, closing his eyes. "She's going to be okay," he whispered to himself, the words both a statement and a prayer. The crowd in the waiting area began to settle as the news of Lily Rose's stabilization spread, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Whispers filled the space as people speculated about the lockdown and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the baby. Elijah stayed rooted by the window of the consultation room, his hand still pressed against the cold glass. The faint reflection of his face stared back at him, gaunt and pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind him, Rosalind approached quietly, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. She carried a fresh blanket, draping it over his slumped shoulders with gentle care. "You did everything you could," she said softly, her voice carrying a comforting warmth. "And she's fighting because of you." Elijah turned slightly to glance at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and doubt. "It doesn't feel like enough," he murmured, his fingers twitching at his sides. Rosalind placed a steadying hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "It is," she said firmly. "You gave her a chance, and sometimes that's all anyone can do." Before Elijah could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. Officer Reyes and another uniformed officer approached, their faces grim. "Elijah Walker," Reyes called, her voice sharp and authoritative. Elijah tensed, his shoulders stiffening as he turned to face them. "We need to ask you some more questions," she said, gesturing for him to follow. Rosalind stepped forward protectively, her gaze hardening. "Is this really necessary right now? That boy's been through enough tonight." "This is an ongoing investigation, ma'am," Reyes replied curtly. "We need to do our job." Elijah hesitated before nodding. "It's okay," he said quietly to Rosalind, though his voice betrayed his fear. He followed the officers down the hallway, the weight of their presence pressing heavily on him. The small interview room they entered was no more inviting than the consultation room Elijah had been waiting in earlier. A bare table and 2 chairs sat under the harsh glare of a fluorescent light. The walls were painted a dull gray, their surfaces unmarred except for a single clock ticking loudly. Reyes gestured for Elijah to sit. Her partner remained standing by the door, arms crossed. "Elijah?" Reyes began, pulling out a small notepad. "We've reviewed the footage from the security cameras near your apartment building. It shows you running out of the alley, carrying the baby." Elijah nodded. "That's what I told you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Right," Reyes continued, tapping her pen against the pad. "But what we don't see is anyone else. No one leaving the baby there, no cars driving away, nothing." Elijah frowned, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. "I don't know what to tell you," he said. "She was just there, crying. I heard her and I couldn't just leave her." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Are you absolutely sure you don't know who left her? Maybe you saw someone but didn't realize it, or maybe—" She paused, her tone growing sharper. "Maybe you're not telling us the whole truth." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. "I swear I don't know anything else," he blurted, his voice rising. "I just wanted to help her." The officer by the door shifted, his stern expression softening slightly. Reyes, too, seemed to hesitate, the intensity of her questioning faltering as she studied the boy's face. "All right," she said finally, closing her notebook with a sigh. "For now, we'll take you at your word, but we'll be following up." Elijah nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Back in the treatment room, Doctor." Everett reviewed Lily Rose's updated vitals with Dr. Patel. The baby's oxygen levels had stabilized, and her fever was beginning to break, but her condition remained fragile. "We've bought her some time," Dr. Patel said, folding her arms. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Dr. Everett nodded, his brow furrowed. "I'll keep monitoring her through the night. Let me know the second those lab results come in." As Dr. Patel left, Rosalind entered, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "How is she?" she asked, glancing at the monitors. "Stable," Dr. Everett replied. "But it's touch and go." Rosalind sighed, her shoulders sagging. "And the boy?" "He's telling the truth," Dr. Everett said after a pause. "I don't think he has anything to do with why she was left there." Rosalind gave a small, tired smile. "I could have told you that." Outside the hospital, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing. Reporters lined the barricades set up by the police, their cameras capturing every angle of the scene. "Still no official statement from the hospital," Linda Martinez said, addressing her viewers. "But sources close to the investigation suggest that the baby is now in stable condition. The question remains, who is she, and why was she abandoned?" Behind her, the crowd of onlookers grew restless, their murmurs blending with the hum of the news vans and the occasional crackle of a police radio. Inside, the hospital staff worked tirelessly, their focus on caring for their patients even as the chaos outside loomed. Elijah sat in the consultation room once again, staring out the small window at the darkened sky. He felt utterly drained, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Rosalind entered, her presence as steadying as ever. She handed him a fresh bottle of water and sat down beside him. "She's stable," she said gently. Elijah turned to her, his eyes widening. "Really?" Rosalind nodded. "She's not out of the woods yet, but she's holding on, and that's because of you." Elijah looked away, his throat tightening with emotion. I couldn't leave her," he said quietly. "She didn't deserve that." Rosalind placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "And because of you, she's here. Remember that." The first hints of dawn crept through the windows of Memorial Hospital, softening the harsh fluorescent lighting and casting long shadows across the corridors. Inside, the air was quieter now, though the tension remained palpable. The chaos of the night had given way to a heavy, watchful silence, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Elijah sat in the same chair he'd occupied for hours, his body stiff and weary. The weight of exhaustion pulled at him, but he refused to close his eyes. His mind wouldn't allow it. Every time he blinked, he saw Lily Rose in the alley, her tiny face pale and her breaths faint. The memory haunted him, refusing to let go. The door opened slowly, and Dr. Everett stepped in, his white coat slightly rumpled from the long night. He carried a clipboard, though it hung loosely in his hand as he approached Elijah. "She's stable," Dr. Everett said, his tone calm but firm. "We've started her on a treatment plan, and it's working." Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with relief. "She's okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "She's on the road to recovery," Dr. Everett clarified. "But it'll be a long process. She'll need to stay here for a while, and we'll have to run more tests to make sure there aren't any underlying issues. But for now, she's doing better." The tension in Elijah's body seemed to melt away as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Dr. Everett studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "You did the right thing bringing her here," he said. "You may have saved her life." Elijah looked down at his hands, the praise feeling foreign. "I just couldn't leave her," he said quietly. Dr. Everett nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Not everyone would have done what you did. It takes courage." Meanwhile, in the pediatric ICU, Lily Rose lay in her bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. The machines surrounding her beeped softly, their steady cadence a reassuring presence. Nurse Rosalind stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped in front of her as she watched the baby sleep. A soft smile graced her lips, though her eyes betrayed the lingering worry she carried. "Keep fighting, little one," she murmured. Dr. Patel entered the room, her expression a mix of professionalism and compassion. She glanced at the monitors and then at Lily Rose, nodding to herself. "She's a fighter," Dr. Patel said, her voice quiet. Rosalind looked up at her, a hint of a smile returning. "She has to be." Outside the hospital, the media frenzy was beginning to thin as reporters packed up their equipment, the night's story now evolving into the day's headlines. The initial panic and speculation had given way to a quieter, more subdued curiosity. Linda Martinez stood near the barricades, her microphone in hand as she prepared for one final report. "Authorities have confirmed that the baby, now named Lily Rose, is in stable condition after receiving emergency medical care. While questions remain about her origins, one thing is clear: her story has touched the hearts of many. This is Linda Martinez, reporting live from Memorial Hospital." As her cameraman signaled that the segment was over, Linda let out a sigh of relief, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension. Inside, Elijah stood by the window of the consultation room, watching the sky turn lighter by the minute. The weight of the night still clung to him, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Rosalind entered, her soft footsteps breaking the silence. She carried a tray with a warm bagel and a fresh cup of cocoa, setting it on the table beside him. "You should eat," she said gently. Elijah nodded, though he didn't move to pick up the food. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "She's going to be okay," Rosalind said, her voice steady. "And so are you." Elijah turned to her, his eyes filled with questions he didn't know how to voice. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Rosalind hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "CPS will step in to take care of Lily Rose for now," she said. "And as for you, we'll figure it out together." Her words carried a promise, one that Elijah clung to like a lifeline. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Dr. Everett sat at his desk, reviewing Lily Rose's file. The night's events had left him drained, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing they'd made the right decisions. He glanced out the window, watching as a few reporters lingered near the hospital's entrance. His thoughts drifted to Elijah, the boy who had defied every assumption and brought hope to a child in desperate need. Sometimes it takes just one person, Dr. Everett murmured to himself, a faint smile on his lips. In the hallway outside Lily Rose's room, Elijah stood with Rosalind, the two of them watching the tiny figure inside. For the first time, Elijah allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd done. Not the fear or the doubt, but the simple fact that he had made a difference. "She's going to be okay," Rosalind said again, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Elijah nodded, a small, hesitant smile breaking through the exhaustion. "She is," he said, "and so am I." Rosalind stared at the phone in her hand long after the call with Margaret Chen ended, her mind racing with the implications of the conversation. A fund named after Lily Rose, designed to improve the lives of children like Devin, children who had been let down by the system but who still found a way to make a difference. She glanced down the hallway, where Devin sat on a bench near the window, staring into the distance. His thin frame was hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly together as though holding on to something invisible but vital. Walking toward him, she noticed how the golden light of the setting sun softened the harsh lines of his face, making him look younger and more vulnerable. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him, and sat beside him. "Devin?" she began gently, her voice low but steady. He turned his head slowly to look at her, his dark eyes filled with exhaustion and something deeper, something she recognized as hope, tentative and fragile. "I just got off the phone with a woman named Margaret Chen," Rosalind said, her lips curving into a small smile. "She's a philanthropist, and she wants to create a fund in Lily Rose's name, a fund that will help kids in foster care and support families who want to foster." Devin blinked, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed her words. "Because of Lily Rose?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of you," Rosalind corrected, her smile widening. "Because of what you did. You showed people what it means to care, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible." Devin looked away, his gaze drifting back to the window. "I didn't do anything special," he said, his tone heavy with doubt. "I just couldn't leave her there." "And that," Rosalind said, her voice firm, "is exactly what makes it special. You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway. That's what people are seeing, Devin. That's why they're inspired." He didn't respond right away, his fingers twitching slightly as though he didn't know what to do with them. Finally, he let out a shaky breath and nodded. In another part of the hospital, Officer Reyes sat in a small, dimly lit room reviewing the footage from the hardware store one more time. The grainy black and white video played on a loop, showing the woman in the torn winter coat as she approached the alley with the bundle in her arms. Reyes leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied the timestamp on the screen. 9:15 p.m. The exact moment Devin had described. She watched as the woman bent down to place the baby among the stacked boxes, her movements hesitant and full of visible sorrow. "Pause it there," Reyes instructed the technician, pointing to the screen. The video froze, capturing the woman's profile as she stroked the bundle one last time. Her face was partially obscured by the hood of her coat, but the way her hand lingered on the blanket spoke volumes. "She didn't want to leave her," Reyes murmured, her voice soft, almost to herself. The technician nodded. "We could run facial recognition, but the angle isn't great. Still, it's worth a shot." "Do it," Reyes said, "and check local hospitals for any recent admissions that match her description. She might need medical attention." As the technician got to work, Reyes leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She couldn't shake the image of the woman's hand on the blanket, her fingers trembling as though reluctant to let go. "This isn't just a case," she muttered under her breath. "It's a tragedy." Back in the pediatric ICU, Dr. Hartman stood at Lily Rose's bedside, his arms crossed as he watched the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest. The beeping of the monitors filled the room, their rhythmic sounds reassuring but fragile. Rosalind entered quietly, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. She stood beside Hartman, her eyes also fixed on the baby. "She's a fighter," Rosalind said softly, Hartman nodded, his expression unreadable. She's stable, for now, but we'll need to monitor her closely for the next 48 hours. Rosalind glanced at him, noting the lines of exhaustion on his face. You've been up all night, she said gently. You should take a break. Hartman shook his head. I can't. Not until I know she's out of the woods. There was a long silence between them, the only sound the quiet hum of the machines. Finally, Rosalind spoke again. You did the right thing, lifting the lockdown, she said. I know it wasn't an easy call. Hartman sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. It wasn't just the right thing. It was the only thing. I've made mistakes before, mistakes I can't take back. I wasn't going to let this be another one. Rosalind placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but supportive. We all carry regrets, she said, but you made the right choice today. That matters. Hartman nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Lily Rose. Outside the hospital, the media frenzy had finally begun to subside. Most of the reporters had packed up their equipment, their stories filed, and their cameras no longer trained on the entrance. Devon stood near the glass doors, watching the remaining reporters as they packed their gear into vans. The bright lights that had felt so overwhelming earlier were gone, replaced by the softer glow of the setting sun. Rosalind appeared beside him, her presence quiet and steady. They're leaving, Devon said, his voice tinged with surprise. They got their story, Rosalind replied. And now it's time for us to focus on what's next. Devon glanced at her, his brow furrowing. What happens next? Rosalind smiled, a gentle warmth in her expression. We take it one step at a time, she said. Together. Devon lingered near the hospital's entrance as the last news van pulled out of the parking lot. The air was quiet now, the earlier chaos replaced by a stillness that felt almost surreal. He leaned against the glass door, his reflection faint but visible in the dim light. Rosalind stood beside him, her hands resting lightly in the pockets of her scrubs. You should get some rest, she said softly. It's been a long day. Devon shook his head, his eyes distant. I don't think I could sleep, even if I tried. Rosalind studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Come on, she said, gesturing toward a nearby bench in the hallway. Sit with me for a bit. He hesitated before following her, his step slow and heavy. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the hospital filling the space between them. You know, Rosalind began, her voice gentle. When I was a new nurse, I had a patient, a little boy, who came in with severe asthma. His mom was a single parent, barely making ends meet. She blamed herself for his condition, said she couldn't afford better care for him. Devon glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. I remember sitting with her in the waiting room, Rosalind continued. She was crying, convinced that she'd failed her son. But I told her something that I've held on to ever since. What's that? Devon asked quietly. That doing your best is enough, Rosalind said, her eyes meeting his. Even when it doesn't feel like it. Even when the odds are against you. If you care, if you try, that's what matters most. Devon nodded slowly, her words sinking in. In the hospital's security office, Officer Reyes leaned over a computer screen, her eyes scanning the paused footage from the hardware store. The technician beside her was typing rapidly, pulling up related files and running searches through databases. We're cross-referencing admissions from local hospitals, the technician said, his tone brisk. If she sought medical attention, we'll find her. Reyes nodded, her focus unbroken. The grainy image of the woman on the screen felt like a puzzle piece waiting to be placed. Zoom in on her hand, Reyes instructed, pointing to the screen. The technician adjusted the image, enhancing the section where the woman's hand rested on the blanket. Even in the poor quality of the footage, Reyes could see the faint outline of what looked like a hospital bracelet on her wrist. That's something, Reyes murmured. Run the serial number. It might give us a lead. The technician nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Meanwhile, in Lily Rose's treatment room, Dr. Hartman stood by her bedside, monitoring the steady rise and fall of her chest. Her vitals had stabilized further, and her oxygen levels were holding steady. Rosalind entered quietly, her presence as calm as ever. She approached the crib and placed a hand on the edge, her eyes softening as she looked at the baby. "She's looking better," Rosalind said, her voice a mixture of relief and hope. Hartman nodded. "She's a fighter," he replied, his tone lighter than it had been earlier. They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet interrupted only by the soft beeping of the monitors. "Do you ever think about what happens after?" Rosalind asked suddenly, her gaze still fixed on Lily Rose. Hartman glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "After what?" "After they leave here," Rosalind clarified. "We save their lives, but then what? Where do they go? What kind of lives do they have?" Hartman's expression grew thoughtful. "I try not to dwell on it," he admitted. "But sometimes I can't help wondering." Rosalind nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I think about it all the time," she said, "especially with kids like Lily Rose. They deserve so much more than what life's given them." Hartman sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "We do what we can," he said. "But you're right. It never feels like enough." Outside, the hospital staff began to wind down after the long night. Nurses exchanged tired smiles as they handed off charts, and the once tense atmosphere began to soften. In the break room, Devin sat with a cup of hot chocolate, his hands wrapped around the warm paper cup. Rosalind joined him, sitting across the table with her own cup of tea. "What happens now?" Devin asked, his voice quiet. "Well," Rosalind began, "Lily Rose will stay here for a while until she's strong enough to leave. CPS will take over from there, and they'll make sure she has a safe place to go." Devin nodded, though his expression was heavy. "What about the woman who left her?" "That's what Officer Reyes is working on," Rosalind said. "They'll find her, and when they do, we'll get answers." Devin stared down at his cup, his fingers tracing the rim. "I hope she's okay," he said softly. Rosalind reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You've got a good heart, Devin," she said. "Don't ever lose that." In the security office, Reyes's phone buzzed with a notification. The technician had found a match for the hospital bracelet's serial number. "She was admitted to County General 2 days ago," the technician said. "Postpartum complications. She checked out the same day, but we've got her name and address." Reyes's eyes lit up. "Send the details to my phone," she said, already reaching for her coat. The technician nodded, transferring the information. Reyes stood, her mind racing as she prepared to leave the hospital. She had a lead now, and she wouldn't stop until she found the woman who had left Lily Rose behind. Officer Reyes stepped out into the crisp evening air, her breath visible in the chill as she walked briskly toward her car. The information she'd just received replayed in her mind, a name, an address, and a story that was beginning to take shape. She opened the car door, the interior light casting a soft glow over the notepad and radio on the passenger seat. As she started the engine, she couldn't help but replay the grainy footage in her mind. The woman's hesitant movements, the way she'd lingered over the bundle before walking away. There was more to this story, and Reyes was determined to uncover it. She pulled out of the hospital parking lot, the hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet night. Back inside the hospital, Devin had finally allowed himself to relax, though his exhaustion was evident in the way he slumped in the chair near Lily Rose's room. Rosalind sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring as she scrolled through messages on her phone. "You should try to sleep," she said, glancing at him. Devin shook his head. "I don't want to leave her," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the crib visible through the treatment room window. "She's in good hands," Rosalind said gently. "Dr. Hartman and the team are watching her like hawks. You've done your part." Devin remained silent, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Rosalind leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You know, when I first started working here, I used to stay late after my shifts," she said, her tone conversational. "I thought if I just worked a little harder, stayed a little longer, I could fix everything." Devin glanced at her, curious. "But I learned something important," Rosalind continued. "Sometimes doing your best means knowing when to step back. You've done everything you can for Lily Rose. Now you need to take care of yourself, too." Her words seemed to sink in, and Devin nodded slowly. At the address Reyes had been given, a small, weathered house sat under the faint glow of a street lamp. The lawn was overgrown, the paint peeling from the wooden siding, but a light shone in one of the windows, signaling that someone was home. Reyes parked her car a few houses down, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before stepping out. She walked up the cracked concrete path, her boots echoing softly in the quiet neighborhood. Reaching the door, she knocked firmly, the sound reverberating through the still night. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She wore an oversized sweatshirt that hung loosely on her thin frame. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice cautious. "Ms. Danielle Marsh," Reyes said, her tone professional but not unkind. The woman hesitated before nodding. "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm Officer Reyes," she replied, showing her badge. "I'm here about the baby you left behind." Danielle's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please, come in," she said, her voice shaking. Reyes stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the modest living room. The furniture was mismatched and worn, but the space was clean, with a few toys scattered on the floor, a sign of children who had once played there. Danielle sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't take care of her. I didn't want her to suffer." Reyes pulled out her notepad, though she didn't immediately write anything down. "Why didn't you reach out for help?" she asked gently. Danielle shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't think anyone would care," she admitted. "I've been on my own for so long. No family, no support. When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to prepare, but nothing went the way it was supposed to." Her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands. Reyes sat across from her, her expression softening. "Leaving her in that alley. It must have been the hardest thing you've ever done," she said. Danielle nodded, her sobs shaking her fragile frame. "I stayed as long as I could," she whispered. "I wanted to make sure someone found her. I prayed someone would find her." "They did," Reyes said firmly. "A boy named Devin found her and brought her to the hospital. She's safe now, and she's getting the care she needs." Danielle looked up, her red-rimmed eyes widening. "She's okay?" Reyes nodded. "She's going to be okay?" Danielle let out a choked sob, covering her face again as relief washed over her. Back at the hospital, Rosalind received a text from Reyes. Found her, bringing her in. She showed the message to Dr. Hartman, who nodded solemnly. "It's time we get the full story," he said. Devin, who had been sitting nearby, noticed the exchange and stood up. "Did they find her?" he asked anxiously. Rosalind nodded. "Officer Reyes is bringing her here now." Devin's expression was a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I just want to know why," he said quietly. "We all do," Rosalind replied, her voice steady. Hours later, Danielle Marsh sat in a small consultation room at the hospital, her hands folded tightly on the table. She'd been given a cup of water, though it remained untouched. Her gaze was fixed on the wall, her body tense with nervous energy. Reyes and Rosalind sat across from her, their presence calm but purposeful. "Danielle," Rosalind began, her tone gentle. "We're here to help. We just need to understand what happened." Danielle hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "I loved her," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I still do. But I didn't know how to take care of her. After I left the hospital, I couldn't even afford formula. I had nothing to give her." Her confession hung heavy in the air, each word a testament to her desperation. "You did what you thought was best," Rosalind said, her voice warm. "But now, we need to figure out how to move forward. For both of you." Danielle nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I just want her to have a chance," she whispered. "A real chance." Danielle's sobs filled the small consultation room, her shoulders shaking as the weight of her decisions spilled out. Rosalind leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her, projecting calm and reassurance. "You made a choice that no mother should ever have to make," Rosalind said softly. "But now you have a chance to be part of her story again. It's not too late." Danielle wiped her face with trembling hands. "Do you think she'll hate me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "When she's old enough to understand what I did, will she hate me?" Rosalind hesitated, her heart aching for the woman in front of her. "I think she'll know that you loved her," she said finally. "And that's what matters most." Reyes, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "There are systems in place that can help you," she said. "But it starts with being honest about what you need and what led you to that alley." Danielle nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered. "I just want her to be okay." In the pediatric ICU, Devin stood at the window of Lily Rose's room, his reflection barely visible in the darkened glass. Her tiny chest rose and fell steadily now, each breath a small victory. The soft beeping of the monitors provided a soothing rhythm, a reminder of the progress she'd made. Rosalind approached him, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. "She's doing better," she said, her voice gentle. Devin nodded but didn't look away from the window. "I can't stop thinking about her," he admitted. "What if no one had found her? What if I hadn't been there?" "You were there," Rosalind said firmly. "And because of you, she has a future. Don't let the what-ifs take that away from you." Devin turned to her, his eyes glistening. "What happens now?" Rosalind placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's still being decided, but I promise she's going to be surrounded by people who care about her." Devin nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. In the consultation room, Danielle was finally beginning to open up. She spoke haltingly, her voice tinged with shame and sorrow. "After I gave birth, everything went wrong," she said. "I couldn't afford to stay at the hospital. I couldn't afford anything. My landlord was threatening to evict me, and I hadn't eaten in days." Reyes listened intently, her notepad resting on the table. "Why didn't you go to a shelter?" she asked. "I tried," Danielle said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But they were full. Everywhere I turned, it felt like there was no room for me or my baby." Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. "I thought maybe someone else could do better for her, someone who had more to give." Rosalind's heart ached at the raw pain in Danielle's voice. "It sounds like you were overwhelmed," she said gently. "And you made the only decision you thought you could, but now you have a chance to make things right." Danielle looked up, her expression filled with both hope and fear. "What do I need to do?" Reyes exchanged a glance with Rosalind before replying. "First, we'll connect you with social services. They can help you find stable housing and get you the resources you need. But it's going to take time and commitment." Danielle nodded, her determination clear. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. Later that night, Dr. Hartman joined Rosalind in the break room, both of them nursing cups of coffee as the hospital settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm. "She wants to turn her life around," Rosalind said, stirring her coffee absently. You could see it in her eyes. Hartman sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I hope she can," he said, "for Lily Rose's sake." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Hartman spoke again. "Devin asked me earlier why someone would abandon their child," he said. "I didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain desperation like that to a kid? You don't, Rosalind replied. You just show him that there's more to the story, that even in the darkest moments, there's still hope. Hartman nodded, his gaze distant. He's a good kid, he said. He is, Rosalind agreed. And he deserves to know that what he did mattered. The next morning, the hospital felt lighter somehow, the weight of the previous night's tension having lifted. Devin sat in a chair near Lily Rose's room, his hoodie pulled tight around him as he watched the early sunlight stream through the windows. Dr. Hartman approached, a file in hand. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sitting down beside Devin. Devin shrugged. "Better, I guess," he said. "She's doing better, so that helps." Hartman nodded. "You know, I've been doing this job for a long time," he said. "And I've seen a lot of people come through these doors, but not many of them have made the kind of impact you have." Devin glanced at him, surprised. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said. "Maybe," Hartman replied. "But you're the one who was there. You're the one who made the choice to act. Don't ever forget that." Devin looked down at his hands, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks," he said quietly. In a nearby office, Officer Reyes sat with Danielle, helping her fill out paperwork for social services. The process was slow and tedious, but Danielle didn't complain. She answered every question, signed every form, her determination unwavering. When they finished, Reyes handed her a card with contact information for additional resources. "Take it one step at a time," Reyes said. "You've got a long road ahead, but you're not alone anymore." Danielle held the card tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Reyes nodded, her expression softening. "You're welcome." As the day wore on, Devin finally allowed himself to rest. He sat in a chair by Lily Rose's crib, his head resting on his folded arms. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was a soothing backdrop as he drifted off to sleep. Rosalind watched from the doorway, a small smile on her lips. She turned to Dr. Hartman, who had joined her. "They'll both be okay," she said quietly. Hartman nodded, his gaze lingering on Devin. "Yeah," he said. "They will." The hospital returned to its usual rhythm in the days that followed, the chaotic events of the lockdown giving way to a quieter, more hopeful atmosphere. Nurses exchanged updates on Lily Rose's progress during shift changes, their voices filled with cautious optimism. Devin became a familiar presence in the pediatric wing, always near Lily Rose's room. He spent hours sitting by her crib, watching her sleep or listening to the soft beeping of the monitors. The medical staff had grown used to his quiet dedication, often bringing him snacks or gently reminding him to take breaks. Rosalind found him there one afternoon, his hoodie pulled over his head as he dozed in the chair beside the crib. She stepped into the room, her footsteps soft, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to wear yourself out," she said gently. Devin stirred, blinking groggily. "I'm fine," he mumbled, straightening up. Rosalind smiled knowingly. "She's stable," she said. "You don't have to be here every second." Devin shook his head. I don't want her to wake up alone," he said quietly. Rosalind's heart ached at his words. She pulled up a chair beside him and sat down. "She's lucky to have you," she said. "But you can't pour from an empty cup, Devin. You need to take care of yourself, too." He nodded reluctantly, though he didn't move from his seat. In another part of the hospital, Danielle was making progress. With the help of social services, she had secured temporary housing and access to resources she desperately needed. She had met with a counselor who was helping her navigate the next steps in her journey. Officer Reyes stopped by to check in on her, bringing her a cup of coffee from the cafeteria. "How are you holding up?" Reyes asked, sitting across from her in a quiet corner of the hospital. Danielle sighed, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm not completely alone." Reyes nodded, her expression encouraging. "That's a good start," she said. "Just remember it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to do this on your own." Danielle managed a small smile. "I'm trying," she said. The day finally came when Lily Rose was well enough to leave the ICU. She was transferred to a recovery ward where her progress continued to be closely monitored. Devin walked alongside the nurses as they wheeled her crib down the hallway, his heart lifting with every step. Dr. Hartman met them in the recovery ward, his demeanor lighter than it had been in days. "She's doing remarkably well," he told Devin. "Another few days and she should be ready for discharge." Devin felt a mixture of relief and sadness. "What happens then?" he asked. "CPS will take over," Hartman explained. "They'll place her in a foster home while her case is reviewed. It's standard procedure." Devin nodded, though the thought of saying goodbye to Lily Rose weighed heavily on him. That evening, Rosalind found Devin sitting outside on a bench near the hospital's garden. The cool air carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the faint sound of rustling leaves filled the quiet space. She sat beside him, her presence comforting. "You've done something incredible, Devin," she said. "And no matter what happens next, Lily Rose is going to have a chance because of you." Devin looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of a folded piece of paper. "Do you think she'll remember me?" he asked. Rosalind smiled softly. "She may not remember your face," she said, "but she'll carry the love you've shown her. That's something that never fades." Devin unfolded the paper, revealing a small drawing he had made of a rose. "I was thinking, maybe I could give her this," he said hesitantly. "Something to remind her of her name." Rosalind's eyes softened. "I think she'd love that," she said. The next morning, Devin placed the drawing on Lily Rose's bedside table. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the edge of the crib, before stepping back. Danielle arrived later that day, escorted by Officer Reyes. Her nervousness was palpable as she approached the recovery ward, her hands clutching the strap of her bag tightly. When she saw Lily Rose, tears welled in her eyes. The baby was sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Rosalind and Dr. Hartman stood nearby, giving Danielle space to process the moment. "She's beautiful," Danielle whispered, her voice trembling. "She's been through a lot," Rosalind said gently. "But she's a fighter, just like her mom." Danielle turned to her, gratitude shining in her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she said. As the sun set over the hospital, Devin prepared to leave. Rosalind walked him to the door, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You've done something extraordinary, Devin," she said. "Don't ever forget that." He looked up at her, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "I won't," he said. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around him like a fresh start. The weight of the past few days had shifted, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He glanced back at the hospital one last time, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Stay strong, Lily Rose," he whispered before walking away. Inside, Rosalind watched him go, her heart swelling with pride. She turned back toward the ward, ready to continue the work that had always been her calling, bringing hope to those who needed it most. And in the crib by the window, Lily Rose slept soundly, her future bright with possibilities.